In 1919, William Carlos Williams wrote the poem Epitaph. It reads, Epitaph. An old willow with hollow branches slowly swayed his few high, bright tendrils and sang, Love is a young green willow, shimmering at the bare wood's edge. In 2024, Atticus Poetry on Instagram wrote, I love you more than chocolate, heart. I love you more than chocolate, she said. And I just wasn't ready for that sort of pressure. Today I want to compare some more recent poems I've come across with poems that I actually think are good, but what I just did was a little unfair. I Love You More Than Chocolate Heart by Atticus Poetry was obviously meant to be a little more facetious in tone and delivery than a very weighty poem like Epitaph. I want the comparisons I make in this video to be as fair and in as good a faith as I can muster, so let's take a look at Atticus Poetry's more serious works. She wasn't waiting for a knight. She was waiting for a sword. Atticus. Put your head up, he said, for you are a lion. Don't forget that, and neither will the sheep. Atata-ikus. Baby, I love your jazz. Ataius. So here we can see what I would call a lack of depth in the Insta Poets canon here. I want to return to Epitaph for a moment. It's a very touching poem. There is a palpable sadness to it, heightened by a grim foreboding in its title, but there is also such loveliness in the spry old willow's song, and there's so much to be interpreted from it. Is the willow lamenting his youth, or imagining himself to still be young through the song? Is the young willow in this song, this symbol of love, one last bastion of life in the otherwise desolate woods surrounding it? Or is that willow the point at which growth begins, revitalizing the bare wood it sits before? William Carlos Williams was a master of sharp, cutting imagery packed into very few words. Atticus Poetry is a master of recycling cliches and creating the poetic equivalent of pop rocks. She sat in her perfect house, with her perfect husband, wishing that her perfect life would end. Then they keep scrolling. What does that actually leave the reader with? This lady's going to stab someone. You're a predator. 2016 B-movie meme core. Now, part of why I find these poems especially bad is because they are especially commercial. They're clearly designed just to be posted online. And you could at least partially blame poetry queen Rupi Kaur for this. She certainly went a long way in popularizing poems that read like pithy star readings. Don't mistake salt for sugar. If he wants to be with you, he will. It's that simple. I do not need the kind of love that is draining. I want someone who energizes me. And here you are living, despite it all. Yeah, man. Here I am. But a lot of people have already driven that hate wagon, and I don't want to linger on her work for too long because frankly, I don't think there's much to talk about. The work isn't substantive enough to criticize beyond a lack of substance. It's designed to explain itself. It has pictures if you get confused. And let me assure you, it's not the length of these poems that prevent them from having depth. Look at this absolutely crushing poem by Langston Hughes, lamenting the loss of his friend. How about this bleak, bleak work by Coleridge on the advent of winter? Our second tree-based poem today, if you're counting. Look at Maya Angelou paint this captivating picture of insomnia as if it were the result of failing to woo sleep to her. These certainly aren't the poet's deepest work, but look how much they can pack into these little fragments. And they do it with a masterful understanding of poetic devices at their disposal. And I'm talking even the basics, man, like simile, metaphor, personification, the stuff you learned in middle school. Let's go back to Rupi Kaur for just a second longer because her work shows it so blatantly. With a lot of contemporary poetry I've seen, especially these Insta poems, poetic devices are by and large just thrown out the window. But her poems are exceptional here in that she nearly forgoes them entirely. Even Atticus Poetry once stumbled into using a metaphor. And I'm not saying you always have to use a certain amount of this. You're not required to make every cloud cry and flower dance, but you have to do something beyond just writing a basic aphorism and splitting it into a few lines. Without these poetic tools, without substance, without a willingness to take creative risks, you're not left with much of a voice here. I mean, a lot of this stuff feels to me indistinguishable from any motivational stock image you can find on Google, but that's not always the case. And that's why I'm finally moving on from this horrible mire into another horrible mire. This next poet I want to discuss for comparison is at least attempting to create a voice for himself, but as I think you'll see, his work is plagued by similar troubles. So here's the immortal work of Sam Pink. When I see a frog, and it takes a hop away from me, it's like, what the f***, man? The woodchuck in my backyard doesn't trust me. And he's right, because the first chance I get, I'm gonna put this tiny witch hat on him. Stupid piece of. You can see he's using vulgarity to convey heightened emotions and display a more colloquial manner of writing. Or maybe he's just being lazy. I said maybe. I don't know. Now, this is a very Bukowskian style of writing, and anyone who knows me knows I'm a big Bukowski boy. Bukowski's poetry is also generally short, prosaic, and uses a lot of vulgarity, but it also has substance, and I think Bukowski is more sincere in his tone, whereas these feel very performatively aloof, in a way that's kind of like really annoying. Bukowski is also interested in not only taking creative and stylistic risks, but also covering more difficult and hard-hitting topics. Which I certainly have not read all of Mr. Pink's canon, but I did genuinely try and search for more emotionally compelling ones. And I did find a poem of his and a poem of Bukowski's that I felt had a similar message, so I'll be comparing these two next. This is Yesterday's Bull Dies Today by Sam Pink. Also, I'm sorry I'm censoring all these, which, one could argue is a little unfair, but I'm just trying not to get shadow banned. Watching a breeze move through some grass, I imagined it was just the grass, shaking off yesterday's bullshit, to prepare for today, to prepare for more bull. Okay, go ahead and take a second to soak that in. Okay, and here's Cut While Shaving from Bukowski. It's never quite right, he said, the way people look, the way the music sounds, the way the words are written. It's never quite right, he said. All the things we are taught, all the loves we chase, all the deaths we die, all the lives we live. They are never quite right. They are hardly close to right. These lives we live, one after the other, piled there as history, the waste of the species, the crushing of the light and the way. It's not quite right. It's hardly right at all, he said. Don't I know it? I answered. I walked away from the mirror. It was morning. It was afternoon. It was night. Nothing changed. It was locked in place. Something flashed. Something broke. Something remained. I walked down the stairway and into it. Okay, a moment to process. So I don't really think this is a question here. Both poems in my mind are tackling the monotony of life, but Bukowski's is the much better read. In this poem, the man Bukowski is speaking to likens the monotony of human history to a feeling of alien discomfort. Nothing ever feels right because there's nothing behind it, and it feels like there should be. That is a really interesting way to frame an existential crisis, and it is very evocative of that dissociative dread you can get into when you stare at something too long or repeat your name too many times. And see the way he uses line breaks to emphasize certain things, or to simulate a quickening of pace, and then a full break to stop and give himself a dramatic pause before Bukowski gives his reply, and then another pause before the reveal that this man he was speaking to was his reflection. See him breaking out of that fugue here. He feels at the same time some revelation that illuminates something within him, destroys something within him, but ultimately leaves him where he started. And it's up to him to make his way down the stairs and continue on this doomed path. Then we got this other one. I see a blandness in approach, no pacing, and a personification of grass so weak that not even the author can commit to it. I don't want to sound pedantic here, but you can be inventive in your poetry, right? You don't have to imagine the grass doing anything. You can make it come to life, like the tree from earlier. And where's the rhythm or pace? It's just rows of similarly sized lines over and over and over. Perhaps the intent was to be boring so as to embody the message of the poem. In which case, I don't feel it was worth it. And that, by the way, is a huge problem in all of the poems I've been criticizing so far. Where is the rhythm? Here's another Pink poem. I see an old man on a motorized cart, steering with one hand, holding a leaf blower with the other, He was blowing leaves around
Monotony.
in different directions.
Literal monotony.
driving
It's
aimlessly in the
monotone.
middle.
Poems don't have to be like this, even the short ones, but especially not the not short ones, the long ones. Poetry is the art of the written word. It's not just prose with the sentences chopped up. You need an eye for meter and prosody to make a compelling poem. You need to know when to throw in an enjambment or punctuate the line or do away with punctuation entirely. You, as the poet, can set the pace for the reader, and, if you so choose, vary that pace to make it more interesting. And no, I'm not saying all poems have to be an iambic pentameter, or rhyme, or even be conventionally done. Look at this stroke of genius, and possibly actual stroke, from E.E. Cummings. And you know what? I'm being serious here. You either get that, or you don't. Go back to Insta poetry if you don't rock with my boy Double E. I'll say this, here's one pink poem that I found promising. Our third and final tree-based poem of the day. Masters. I respect trees for picking a place to live and doing as much as they can there and dying there and never really making mistakes. I mean, look, it's also just a thought partitioned out into a few lines, but it does feel genuine to me. It lacks that forced, IDGAF attitude that the others have. I think there's something poignant here, and I wanted to include it to note that I don't think we've run out of things to say. I just think we've largely abandoned the techniques to say them well. Anyway, if we were to do a recap, I think that we've collected 3 symptoms of the bad contemporary poem epidemic. The poems lack substance, they're not concerned with using interesting poetic devices, and they ain't got rhythm. This leads me to the final comparison I want to make in this video, and as fair as I tried to make it, I think the difference is very stark and worth seeing. This is comparing a beloved classic to a poem I saw that bothered me so much I decided to make this video. But before I do this, I want to be clear that I am not trying to compartmentalize all modern or contemporary poems into this box and say they're all like this or they're all bad. I've gathered here what I would say has floated to the top of the trash heap in the modern day and age. I thought it would be interesting to discuss, as I think it does show a decline in artistry among writers brought on by an era that favors nearly any other medium over the written word. But if you like any of the poems that I've been criticizing, okay, I'm going to read both these poems as they are written as best I can, and afterwards I will share which one I think is the good one, and which one I think sucks, and why. But I am trying to give you, my single viewer, a chance to experience these poems fairly and form your own opinion before I shove mine into your eyes and ears. If I Had 3 Lives, after Melbourne by the Whitlams. If I had 3 lives, I'd marry you in 2. The other? Perhaps that life over there, at Starbucks, sitting alone, writing a memoir, maybe a novel or this poem. No kids, probably. A small apartment with a view of the river, and books, lots of books, and time to read. Friends to laugh with, and a man sometimes, for a weekend, to remember what skin feels like when it's alive. I'd be thinner in that life, vegan, practice yoga. I'd go to art films, farmers markets, drink martinis in swingy skirts and big jewelry. I'd vacation on the Maine coast and wear a flannel shirt weekend guy left behind, loving the smell of sweat and aftershave more than I did him. I'd walk the beach at sunrise, find perfect shell spirals, and study pockmarks water makes in sand. And I'd wonder sometimes if I'd ever find you. When you are old. When you are old and gray and full of sleep, and nodding by the fire, take down this book, and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once, and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace, and loved your beauty with love false or true? But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you, and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled, and paced upon the mountains overhead, and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. So, When You Are Old by William Butler Yeats is a favorite of many, and I'm no exception. Yeats as a poet demonstrates such a mastery over diction and prosody that the poems feel like they read themselves. You feel like you're being carried through the stanzas, and in the case of this poem, softly, gently,
dropped into a pit of despair. This ending scene of capital L love fleeing into the mountains and its countenance becoming lost in the night sky is such a crushing and powerful closer, and leaving you there at the end, having this final image in your mind looking wistfully out at the stars above the mountains, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was lost up there. I mean, that's what it's all about, man. This other one by Sarah Russell, I really don't like it. I chose these poems together because I feel that they are about similar topics, which I would broadly describe as love lost, and a bit more specifically, a very intimate connection that leaves an emptiness in its wake. Now, as for the surface level issues I've been harping on through this entire video, they're all here. And I actually found a reddit.com comment in researching this that I think summarizes it pretty well, and unsurprisingly actually touches on some of the points I've mentioned throughout the video in terms of the poem's poor construction. Look, firstly, I go on Reddit all the time and lie about my identity on burner accounts, so I can't confirm whether or not this person is actually a poetry teacher, but if that is the case, please forgive my indiscretion when I say, I feel that this comment seriously misses the biggest flaw in this poem, which is that it doesn't prove its thesis at all. I did listen to the song that inspired this poem, containing the titular phrase, and it was a non sequitur line in the scheme of things, so the poet was working with a generally blank canvas, and she makes it clear what the poem was about by the end, that in this third life, the one the narrator lives for in their own self, they still feel that something is missing, and that person is their spouse in the other two lives. And you know, at least this poem has some attempted substance behind it, which I think is like the lowest possible bar for a piece of writing, but I felt the need to point it out after what we've gone through. I just don't think the poem does a very good job in executing this idea. The bulk of the text is just a collection of pleasant banalities that lead nowhere, and then the poem just kind of slaps you in the face with its meaning at the end. In When You Are Old, Yeats goes out of his way to note the merits of this lost love, that while other suitors may have loved this person's superficial qualities of grace and beauty, only this particular person connected with them on a spiritual level, the soul, and he proved that by continuing to love this person as they age. In 3 lives, there is no time devoted to what makes this love so desirable, why there is such an absence felt in a life bereft of it. In fact, upon closer inspection, these little vignettes into the third life raise some alarming points. I can understand things like having more time to read without a partner or kids, or more freedom to travel, but also the narrator says that in this third life they have friends to laugh with, as if to imply in the other 2 lives they don't. They would also be thinner and vegan, as if this twice married spouse is forcing them to bulk up on steaks. Or in this closer, which I do find cliched, they go to the beach, which you can take your family to the beach. The repeated mention of non-serious hookups I also find exceptionally strange in its wording. To remember what skin feels like when it's alive. Are you feeling dead skin more frequently than alive skin? What about your skin? Are you a zombie in this third life? Is your skin like shriveled and flaking off onto your swingy dress and big jewelry? Now obviously that's not the poet's intent, from my understanding. The idea I interpret as trying to be conveyed here is that this third life is more self-centered and independent, but the narrator still feels the absence of their spouse, and no art film, fling, or farmer's market can fill that void. Hey, by the way, you can buy meat at the farmer's market. Maybe your spouse will let you go to the farmer's market if you tell them there's meat. Just go to the farmer's market. Just go. Why can't you go? I'm sorry, okay, now, see, now I'm starting to go off the rails. Anyway, as I hope I demonstrated, and in line with the comment from earlier, everything mentioned about this third life seems not very thoughtfully constructed. And obviously neither are the other 2 lives that weren't mentioned at all, which leaves the poem having not mentioned any merits to this life, or the other life with the spouse, aside from, I guess, a consistent access to live skin. And those references to the casual flings are the closest it gets to making some sort of contrast, especially this ending, which is as callous as it is saccharine, where the narrator notes that they love the smell of Weekend Guy more than Weekend Guy himself, in reference to how unfulfilling these brief flings are, before standing out on the shore collecting seashells, longing wistfully for monogamy. I think this poem could have done better to actually contrast the pros and cons of this life with the other two lives, or mention anything about this person so great you'd marry them twice. I mean, if you mention this grand love here, and then mention it here, and then don't mention anything about the love whatsoever here, then how am I supposed to feel? What am I buying into exactly? It seems like this poem is more interested in having the reader do the heavy lifting and imagine their own spouse who won't let them have friends or go outside. Which is a valid approach on one hand, but as I've hoped to convey through these jests, seems to actively work against the poem's intentions. To return to When You Are Old one last time, this poem is significantly shorter, and I want to take a moment to appreciate how in its brevity it manages to convey the weight of a love's irrevocable loss. The poem is so tragic, a brooding on the agony of bereavement that comes with age. Your looks and vivacity fade, the people you love die, you grow tired. And yet there is a repose for old willows with hollow branches, a comfort in that the passage of time has rendered this deep pain into only a murmur, a little sad, yes, but that book, that memory, is itself an invaluable vestige of that love once felt, a youthful love at the foot of the mountains, a young green willow, shimmering at the bare wood's edge. Call it poetry. And that's what it was all leading up to. Anyway, send this video to arborists who love poems. And as an addendum, I'll preempt this criticism. Well, at Cole Rudy, I don't see you sharing your poetry. Yeah. You're welcome. Anyway, I'm signing off.